Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 4 of my Mean Streets of Gadgetzan card review. This time around I have a couple new legendaries and a whole slew of neutral cards to take a look at. So let's go ahead and jump right in with the first one. This is Auctionmaster Beardo. 3 mana, 3/4 minion, neutral legendary of course, and has an effect after you cast a spell, refresh your hero power. So I guess the idea with this is you play Beardo, you hero power once, and then say you cast a backstab, a free spell, you hero power again, then say you cast another backstab, and you hero power again. So each time a spell sort of resets that hero power, allowing you to click it again. So in Rogue in particular, that wouldn't do a lot, right? Because you'd essentially have 3 fresh weapons. So that's not a very good use case for this, but a lot of heroes do have hero powers that sort of stack in a single turn. Warrior, you could get, multiple instances of armor. Mage, you could ping multiple times. Druid, you could stack up like a 3 to 4 attack hit in some armor as well. So not every class makes a lot of sense with this right away. Well, I should really say not every hero power makes a lot of sense with this right away, because there are multiple ways to adjust and change your hero power in Hearthstone, of course. But some classes certainly could benefit from being able to use their hero power multiple times in a single turn. But ultimately, I think the problem with this card's design is that hero powers just aren't all that powerful. They're very, very efficient in that they allow you to spend mana without utilizing a card as a resource. So, of course, hero power is important and good for the game. But being able to do them multiple times in a single turn comes at a pretty great cost because they're not efficient. From a mana standpoint, they don't do enough for what they cost. You'd never play a 2 mana spell that did 1 damage, for instance, the Mage hero power. So if you play Auctionmaster Beardo and you commit to multiple hero powers in a single turn, which is what he is encouraging, then it's not really doing all that much for you. You're spending a lot of mana for very, very little return. So that's one fundamental problem with this guy. The second, I think, is that mana costs just start to add up really fast. If you play him for 3, you hero power for 2, that's already 5 mana spent in a single turn. So if you have some spells, maybe free spells or very cheap spells like an Arcane Missiles, that puts you at 6. You get to hero power again. But if you Arcane Missiles a second time, you're out of mana. So you don't really get a lot of actual benefit out of this effect, just because in most instances you'll run out of mana before you get to use your hero power 3 or 4 times. Now, clearly that's at a base level. There are all kinds of synergies with this card that could make that less of a problem. For instance, there's ways to reduce the cost of your hero power. There's ways to reduce the cost of spells, of course, with cards like Emperor Thaurissan. So yes, I can imagine a world where you play this guy for 1 to 2 mana and you have a bunch of 0 mana spells and you get to hero power like 8 times because you have a Maiden of the Lake out or something, right? There's certainly possibilities where that can happen, but for plays like that to exist, it means you have to sacrifice a lot of resources up to that point. You have to set up these really intricate combos and draw all the right cards in all the right orders. And although that might make some cool highlight videos or some funny like trolled-in video moments, it won't, to me, be a competitively viable way to play this card on the ladder in a real setting, trying to win games, because it's just going to be too inconsistent. So ultimately, when I look at this card, the thing that kind of intrigues me the most is just that it's a neutral 3 mana 3/4, which is a decent stat allocation, so it's kind of playable in that regard almost. We don't have a lot of great neutral 3 mana 3/4s. There's some others, Twilight Elder, for instance. So it's one with a little bit more upside. So you're absolutely desperate to fill in something in your curve. I guess this could do it. But again, I just don't think this effect, although very unique, is actually strong enough. And it doesn't even compare to the Gadgetzan Auctioneer, which is a nutty effect with tons of upside. This one's just not going to do enough, and it's not going to do it fast enough. So to me, Auctionmaster Beardo is actually a pretty bad card. Ultimately, in summary, despite the body, just won't do anything. So moving on to the next one, it is the new Rogue Legendary Shaku the Collector. It is a 3 mana minion with 2/3 in stats, and it has an effect Stealth, to start, but also another effect whenever this attacks at a random card to your hand from your opponent's class. So this is intriguing, right? It's yet another commitment by Blizzard to make Rogue the we're going to borrow cards from you class and find ways to synergize with that effect. So Blizzard is going to force that down our throats. So far, it hasn't really taken as the primary Rogue archetype or seen a lot of success in the latter, but the more and more cards we get for that, maybe it will. Who knows? This one could certainly contribute to that because it has the potential to give you a couple random cards from your opponent. One at the very least most of the time, and perhaps two if you get lucky. So that's a nice upside. It's kind of a draw card, and it's an opponent's card. So all the synergies, the ethereal peddler discounts, all that stuff certainly exists as a way to make this card a little better. But also just drawing a card is good. So you're going to get a card back when you play this guy 90% of the time, because he will typically live through his stealth phase, particularly on turn 3. So on top of that, we also have to look at his stats a little bit. He's a 2/3 for 3, so that's not super exciting, right? That's understated. I actually think this card could maybe be a 3/3 and not be super overpowered, just since it's a legendary. It would be a little overtuned perhaps, but I think that would make it more playable. I'm not sure at this point that Shaku the Collector is going to make a lot of decks, just because the body doesn't do a ton. The stealth effect is really just there to guarantee that you get the card back. So to me, this isn't really all that much better than, say, like an Undercity Huckster, for instance. It's only slightly better stats, more expensive, not a ridiculous upside by any means. Theoretically, you could draw infinite attacks infinite cards if this guy got to keep attacking, but that's incredibly unlikely. Opponents will be able to kill this relatively easily at 3 health. I almost think this is the kind of card that might be better if it was like a 1/4 instead of a 2/3, because you're probably not too worried if it's killing minions on your opponent's side of the board. You just want it to have a little bit more survivability so that it can live through multiple turns. Plus, it could ping off 1 health stuff more efficiently as a 1/4. It could almost be like a pseudo Acolyte of Pain in that scenario. So I think that would make it even better. As it stands, it's not bad by any means. It's playable. It's just not exciting, not class-defining. It's not going to win you games on its own. It's just maybe a slightly above average card at best, and probably just average. And I think people will play with it, but it doesn't really feel like a legendary to me. It doesn't seem overpowered. It's not going to make Rogue instantly good. So Shaku the Collector, fun, cool, but probably average at best. So let's move on to some of the epic cards I'm going to take a look at today, starting off with the Fel Orc Soulfiend, the 3-mana, 3/7 minion. This is a neutral minion, of course, and it has a pretty neat effect. At the start of your turn, deal 2 damage to this minion. So a lot of people would compare this immediately to the Injured Blademaster, which is the 3-mana 4/7 that does 4 damage to itself instantly when it's played from the hand. It's a Battlecry effect. So that typically comes down as a 4/3. And this would actually still come down as a 3/7. This is at the start of your turn. It's not a Battlecry. So during your defense phase, while your opponent takes control, you play this, your opponent gets control, they're looking at a 3/7. It still has its full stats. But when it's passed back to you, it takes damage and becomes a 3/2. So what that means in essence is that if your opponent wants to kill the minion, they only have to do 5 damage to it. They can just take it to 3/2 and it will kill itself at the start of your turn, and you won't get to utilize it. So it's functionally a 3/5 basically right from the start as far as the actual functional stats are concerned. It looks like a 3/7, but in essence it's a 3/5. For 3 mana, and a 3/5 for 3 mana is actually really good. That's very, very strong. 3/4 is kind of the vanilla stat you'd expect, and a 3/5 is even better than that, of course, because it's harder to deal 5 damage than 4, and it still trades pretty effectively into stuff. And it's much harder for your opponents to deal 5 damage to a card like Fel Orc Soulfiend than it is to do 3 damage to an Injured Blademaster on turn 3. So Priest is obviously the class that has utilized Injured Blademaster the most, and this is the kind of card that still, I think, makes sense in Priest in many ways. Because if it does survive, Priest has ways to heal it back up and essentially negate the negative effect on this using their hero power. They just use 2 mana to turn off that effect so that it continues to stay alive. But that said, I actually don't know that this is just a Priest card. I think this has a lot of implications also as a taunt receiver. If you use stuff like Defender of Argus on this card, then your opponent is looking at a giant body that they have to work through. And if they're trying to kill you on their turn right after you play this, they still have to do the full 7 damage, not just 5, because they want to get through the taunt and push through face damage. So in those instances, those sort of last-ditch efforts where you use this as a taunt to deny face damage, it actually gets its full stat value right away. So it gets even better if you're able to taunt it up. So I could see this in that setting, certainly in Priest or classes that can heal it. It gets some extra value too. All that said, I don't know that it's a really, really strong card or anything. Priest uses Injured Blademaster in Resurrect style decks currently, and this is not as good with Resurrect decks because that Blademaster is a permanent 4/7. This guy's taking 2 damage every turn. So the longer he's out, the more committed you have to get to keeping him alive and healing him. So there's some downside there. Plus, of course, he only has 3 attack instead of 4. So much worse than Resurrect style decks. Probably a little better as a aggro mitigator, like counter to aggro decks, just because he's going to trade just as effectively into small minions and can do the job a little bit faster and a little more efficiently, whereas that Injured Blademaster, when you play it, often just dies to something really cheap, getting buffed and trading up, right? The Flame Imps, for instance, can kill an Injured Blademaster right away. They couldn't deal with a Fel Orc Soulfiend. So probably not a better card to me than Injured Blademaster in any specific way. Very comparable, probably equitable in some scenarios. They're just as good as each other. One might take the edge over another. That said, Injured Blademaster is the card that barely gets played, and I think Fel Orc Soulfiend is probably a card that barely gets played. It might get seen from time to time in very specific kinds of decks that need an early game taunt or something, serving as sort of a Death Lord. But ultimately, it's just an average card that we'll see from time to time. Probably pretty good in Arena, though. So let's move on to the next one. It is the Wind Up Burglebot, a 6-mana mech, 5/5 in stats. Whenever this attacks a minion and survives, draw a card. So this card to me is pretty much junk. I don't think it's very good at all. 6 mana 5/5 is a cost and stat allocation that only works if the card has an incredibly strong effect, i.e. Emperor Thaurissan, Sylvanas. Typically you'd expect higher stat values for a card at this cost. So you have to get something really good in return, and this has a nice effect, but it's just not good enough, right? Because most of the time you're going to play this as a 6 mana 5/5, and it's probably immediately going to die to whatever your opponent has to do in the following turn. So Fireball, minion trades, basically anything almost can kill a 5 health minion at that point in the game, turn 6 or after. So the effect here would 97% of the time go to waste, because it will not attack a minion and survive. Even if this minion actually does survive the turn you play it, how often are you going to attack a minion and have this card still survive after doing so? In other words, aren't most minions at that point in the game going to have 5 attack or more? Very, very often they will. There may be some small minions here or there. You might get this off 20 to 30% of the time that it survives. But of course, it's only going to survive 10% of the time. You're only going to get the effect off 30% of that 10%. So you're already down to 3% effectiveness for this card in actual functional gameplay. So it's very likely that it will never work to actually draw you a card. And frankly, even when it does draw you a card, that's not all that awesome. There's other cards that are similar. Consider something like an Ancient of Lore, perhaps. Similar body, slightly higher cost, guaranteed to draw you a card. And in the past, guaranteed to draw you 2 cards. Instantly, not on a delay. So a lot going against this card, not very much going for it other than the funny artwork and the fact that it has perhaps some mech synergies, but again, not really. So ultimately, this is a pretty bad card. I don't think this will ever see play. It might be okay in Arena, again, maybe it's just an Arena card, but it's an epic, so it won't ever show up in Arena hardly. So even that is not really going to make a difference. Moving on to another one, this is the second-rate Bruiser. It's a 5 mana 4/5 with Taunt, and it costs 2 less if your opponent has at least 3 minions. So at a base level, this is a 5 mana 4/5 with Taunt. Not very exciting, right? We've seen similar kinds of minions at 4 mana with the Evil Heckler. Slightly different stat twist, but same amount of stats, same effect, lower cost. So there's nothing exciting about this at a base level. The real upside here is that if you're playing against an aggressive style of deck and they like to flood the board with minions, this is going to be a 3 mana 4/5 with Taunt. And a 3 mana 4/5 with Taunt is actually pretty good. That's kind of exciting. Another 3 mana with Taunt might be like Fierce Monkey, which is a 3 mana 3/4 with Taunt. So this gets basically a +1/+1 over that at the same cost. Now, all that said, this is a great answer to aggro. It's a cheap taunt, slows down your opponents, forces them to trade through you, but in the end, aggro decks are really, really good at getting through cheap taunts. They have ways to trade up and buff their minions and make hyper-efficient clears. So I don't really think this card is dominant enough or influential enough to make the cuts, even in anti-aggro decks. You'd rather just have some sort of area of effect clear to get to the root of the problem, not just barely slow down your opponent with a medium-sized body. So I think this is probably a little bit of a trap card for new players to some extent, like, ooh, a cheap taunt with upside, and they'll want to run it in their decks. But ultimately, I don't think this card's going to be good enough to make the cut in real high-level decks. I think Chillwind Yeti is really not all that different, right? It's a 4 mana 4/5. Taunt isn't really all that important in the end game. So who knows? I mean, it might work from time to time if the meta goes super, super, super fast, but the rest of the time, I think this card is merely average. But again, probably a good arena card in many ways. So I don't know. We'll see. Moving on to another one, it's the Grook Master, a 5 mana minion, 3/5 in stats, and has a Wind Fury effect. So unfortunately, I think this is another bad card. We've seen a lot of these Wind Fury minions that have this similar sort of stat balance with a moderate attack to a moderate health total. There's a bunch of examples. Thrallmar, Farseer, I think is the name of the card. Nobody plays it. It's like the 2/3 Wind Fury. We've seen some even bigger Wind Furies, like the 5/5 Wind Fury Beast, Dragonhawk something. So none of those are ever played. They're really not even very good in Arena usually, because the root of the problem with these cards is that you don't have Wind Fury on defense. In other words, you commit 5 mana to this card, and it sits there, and your opponent gets to dictate how it's killed. So they can send in whatever minions they want, they can hit it with a spell, and you never actually get to utilize that Wind Fury effect. So you're paying a pretty big price to get a Wind Fury that never actually gets used. So unless you can like stealth this and buff it, then it doesn't do anything. But even in those instances, if you were going to like stealth it and buff it for some sort of crazy big face attack the following turn, you'd want the stats swapped. You'd want it to have a lot of attack and not a lot of health in order to commit additional burst damage. So nothing about this card makes sense. It's just fundamentally weak. It's not going to be good. It's not going to see play. Maybe if it was a beast or something, it could see some sort of fit into a hunter deck, who knows, or a druid deck even that could copy it or stealth it or something, who knows. But I don't even think that would be enough. As it stands, Grook Master is a pretty bad card. Fortunately, there's been a string of those. I don't think it's about to stop soon. Up next is the Friendly Bartender, a 2 mana 2/3 with the most charming and awesome artwork ever, but unfortunately not the card to match. It's got an effect at the end of your turn, restore 1 health to your hero. This might be the most boring 2-drop we've seen in the game yet, outside of the just straight vanilla ones. So it's a 2/3, which is probably what you want in a 2-drop these days. That part of it's fine. It trades occasionally. It's really the effect here that lets you down. Restoring 1 health to your hero is such a passive effect. Doesn't contribute to anything on the board at all. You'd much rather it do 1 damage to a random enemy minion at the end of your turn than actually heal your hero for 1 health. Because that, on turn 2, you're not trying to heal your hero. You're trying to commit to the board and influence the board and take control of the board and actually have an active effect on the game itself, not passively heal your hero. So, a pretty awful effect as far as I'm concerned. It's too weak of a minion in the late game to actually be influential. There are maybe some synergies with cards that get buffed off heals. There are a few of those cards out there, but even then it's like it happens once per turn. So I don't even see that really making much of an impact. Everything about this just seems dreadfully weak and pretty bad, which is unfortunate. Other than this just being a 2-mana 2/3, I don't really think this is even a good arena card. So, Friendly Bartender, unfortunately, it's got really awesome artwork that we'll probably never see because I don't see a reason for anyone to play this card ever. Moving on to another bad card. It's really a shame. This is the Kooky Chemist, 4-mana 4/4. Battlecry, swap the attack and health of a minion. There's not a lot to say about this card other than it's very, very, very similar to its cousin, the Crazed Alchemist. Kooky Chemist, Crazed Alchemist. Both in name, artwork, but also in function. That's a 2-mana 2/2 with the exact same Battlecry. And this is a 4-mana 4/4 instead, so everything's literally just doubled. Very, very intuitive card design, Blizzard. You guys are really getting creative. But all that said, if you're going to run a card and you want that specific Battlecry effect, which happens, Crazed Alchemist is not a bad card at all. It's gotten played a lot to counter totems and doomsayers, all kinds of stuff. It's an interesting, unique effect that certainly has some values in certain applications. So it's not crazy to think that you'd want to run Kooky Chemist instead because it's a bigger body. But really, when you're running like tech cards like that, it's much more important that they're flexible in their mana cost and that you can slot them into a variety of different decks and curves. So having to commit 4 mana to an effect like that is probably always or almost always going to be worse than just having to commit 2 mana to an effect like that. So the fact that this has a slightly higher body isn't really valuable at all because you'd really just rather have the cheap effect and be able to do other cool stuff as well. So maybe occasionally there'd be some really, really specific circumstance where this is better than Crazed Alchemist, but I think that's really rare, and ultimately if you need that exact thing to happen, Crazed Alchemist is going to be a safer bet for you that works 99% of the time. So Kooky Chemist is probably a card that virtually never actually sees play. And it's a pretty lazy card by Blizzard too. Like I like the sort of cousin effect and keeping things in house and referencing past cards, but that card is a part of standard format forever, as is the classic set. So there's really no need to rotate this in. So lazy and weak, unfortunately. So let's move on to the next minion. This is the Big Time Racketeer, a 6-mana 1/1. That's pretty bad. But it has a nice Battlecry, summon a 6/6 Ogre. So that means ultimately, after you play this card, you're going to have 7/7 in stats, which makes it marginally better than the 6-mana Boulder Fist Ogre, which is a basic free card. The problem is there's actually a lot of downsides to this design. So it's very lightly better in stats, right? So there's a marginal upside, but sometimes having 2 minions is a little bit better than having 1 minion, but sometimes it's also worse because, you can fireball the 6/6 Ogre now. You couldn't have done that before if it was a Boulder Fist Ogre. So advantages and disadvantages in the way the stats are split, certainly. But ultimately, there's other problems too, like imagine if this card is summoned from your deck using some sort of effect. Instead of getting a 6/7 Boulder Fist Ogre, you get a 1/1, and the Battlecry never actually activates. So that's one considerable downside. There's just not really any reason to run this card over something like a Boulder Fist Ogre or any other number of amazing 6-drops. This doesn't do anything overpowered. It doesn't do anything cool. Yeah, there's a little bit of synergy with Knife Juggler, for instance, and cards that benefit off summoned minions. But those are small in number and usually lower cost stuff that's all about flooding the board, and this is a higher cost card, so there's really no synergy in mana curve there. You don't want to run this kind of card in a deck that wants to utilize Knife Juggler. very well. So this is just kind of the new Boulder Fist Ogre maybe, but a worse version with a lot of risk and a lot of downside. So I don't like this card at all. I think it's very, very weak, and it won't see play outside of Arena, where it's pretty good in Arena, I think. 1/1s are good in Arena, and big bodies, of course, are good in Arena too. So fine Arena card, but that's about it. Moving on to, I think, the final card in this review. This is the 1-mana minion, the Mistress of Mixtures. It's a 2/2 for 1 mana, which is really quite strong. And it has a Death Rattle, restore 4 health to both players. So it's pretty clear to me this card was designed as a late but definite replacement for Zombie Chow. Zombie Chow being the 1-mana 2/3 that restored 5 health to the enemy hero. And that was used as an anti-aggro card for control or mid-range to control style decks to play early, mitigate the early board that your opponent is trying to build by making very efficient trades with Zombie Chow, and not really caring about its negative death rattle effect because you weren't trying to do damage to your opponent in the early game yet anyway, so who cares if they got healed for 5 health. This card has a very similar design. It's got extra stats at the 1 mana cost. It should really be like a 1/2 or a 2/1. And it has a death rattle that essentially heals the enemy hero. So you don't really care that it heals the enemy hero if you're using it as an early game tool to trade and not as a function of damage. So the negative part of this death rattle doesn't really matter that much in the early game. Plus, of course, restoring 4 health to your own hero is actually rather good, even in the early game if they get off to a fast start and hit you a few times. This can help mitigate that early damage, or just something you can play in the late game as a quick heal. So I don't actually think this is as good as Zombie Chow, just because the 2/2 doesn't trade as well as the 2/3. It dies to attack stuff. So it's unlikely to hit 2 minions and live, unlike Zombie Chow, which would often kill at least 2 things. This probably dies to 1 97% of the time, so it's not quite as good in that regard. The death rattle is slightly better because you're also healing yourself. So there is a little bit of late game application if you're just desperate for a heal. You can play this and hopefully trade it and get some health back. But since it's not quite as strong in the early game, and 1-cost cards are a pretty big risk to run in the late game, I don't really see this fitting in control style decks as well. Plus, this doesn't have the side effect of Zombie Chow, where in Priest you could use Auctionmaster Soul Priest to make Zombie Chow do damage to your opponent. Well, this actually does, I guess, have that effect, but it's got a downside that it also does damage to you, so there's a little bit of risk there, more so than with Zombie Chow. So ultimately, I don't know, I think this probably isn't quite as good as Zombie Chow and isn't played quite as often, but it's actually a decent card that could see play in certain decks, particularly Priest, and who knows what else. I mean, it's not bad at all. So I'd say a slightly above average card that potentially gets run from time to time, but I don't think this will become a defining part of the meta like Zombie Chow was. Just not quite that good. But I'd love to be wrong, because I love early game answers to aggressive metas. That's something I like a lot. So I hope it takes off and it is better than I expect. So that's it for my part 4 review. I mean, looking at these cards, really pretty weak. This is a bad set I reviewed here in this video. Auctionmaster Beardo's weak. Shaku's average at best. Felork Soulfiend's probably average. Wind Up Burglebot's bad. Second Rate Bruiser's average. Gookfu's bad. Friendly Bartender's bad. Kooky Chemist is bad. Big Time Racketeer is mostly bad. And Mistress of Mixtures is probably average. So not a lot of great stuff in this video and a lot of bad stuff. There's always sort of filler cards in Blizzard's expansions where they just want to get some commons in there that maybe trap players or just give you those really rare instances where they work or they're important to Arena. But unfortunately, there seems to be a lot in Gadgetzan so far, so hopefully that is a trend that changes and we see some more good meta-defining cards that really shake things up. But that'll do it for me in part 4 of Mean Streets of Gadgetzan. I'm curious what you guys think about these cards. Was there something I missed? Is there some awesome synergy out there that I didn't see? Are they as bad as I thought? Are they going to be better? Am I going to be surprised? Share your take in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching, And until next time, game on.